the walkthrough inspections, hopefully some of you already completed some of these, so you may be familiar with them. Some references to the previous presentations that we've done. We've got links to all those in this presentation. This presentation will also be sent out to everybody following following today as well. You know, we always like to read a disclaimer that we do not endorse any of the specific brands that we may talk about, manufacturers or specific vendors of equipment, products or services. Any of the brand names mentioned or depicted of any of this equipment, product, or service in this presentation is used just for illustrative purposes only, and we neither endorse nor recommend use of that equipment or service or product. Okay, so we'll be going over the dates that all these requirements go into effect, the monthly walkthrough inspection and its form, and the annual walkthrough inspection with the forms as well. Okay, so EPA's federal rule went into effect that started all this in motion in October 13th of 2015. Since we're what we call a SPA state, a state program approval state, the EPA gives us 3 years to adopt rules no less stringent than theirs. So our deadline for that was October 13th of 2018. Then we get an extra 3 years to implement those rules, hence the October 13th, 2021 date. Okay, so a real quote for this portion of the walkthrough is 0.02, Section 8. If you'd like to see those rules, you can get mesmerized by them if you look at them long enough. A link is below to be able to look at the entire scope of our rules. All right, so our monthly requirement breakdown. Spill prevention for single wall spill buckets. We ask that on our form for you to remove any liquid debris, check for damage, check your fill pipe for obstructions, and make sure your fill pipe's secure and not in contact with your lid. Since this form is finalized now, I have tried to include all the applicable sections from this form for each of these sections of slides that we'll go through. So 1, 2, and 3 on the new form would encompass the requirements that I just talked about a minute ago. And then you'll have a box to initial for each of these questions once you're able to check them off each month. So hopefully this saves everybody a lot of organizational problems as far as keeping up with 4 or 5 different forms. Everything is on one form for pretty much everything you have to do at every facility. So like again, 1, 2, and 3 goes along with a single wall spill buckets. All right, so some examples of the things that you may run into in the field. This is a photo of a spill bucket lid that's in contact with the riser cap. You can see there that there's some wear on both of them. Okay, this is an example of a damaged spill bucket. Everybody's seen them, nothing new here. And then if you happen to see a stick or something down in your fill port, you definitely want to remove that and make note of it. There could be anything in there, rags, I mean, anything. So just check it's something that's sort of new, so we want to make sure that we emphasize that you need to look down in there if you're doing monthlies for one of your tank owners. Okay, so the monthly requirement breakdown. With double wall spill buckets, there is some ways to get out of doing the operability testing. if you have electronic sensors and you monitor them with the interstitial monitoring protocols, so if you keep a alarm history and a monthly sensor status report, then you can avoid doing operability testing. This is also the case with a standalone sensor. If you don't have an ATG and you just have a standalone sensor with a monitoring device just for the sensors, you can also avoid that requirement as well. The liquid float gauges, they still will require operability testing, and just a footnote for all of this is spill bucket operability testing is not part of monthly release detection or monthly leak detection by rule. So it's not the same as monitoring a sump. It's not looked at the same. It's not release detection. Whereas monitoring the sump is the release detection for your piping. Monitoring a spill bucket is not the same. So it doesn't fall under the same requirement as far as release detection goes. But to avoid your operability testing, you can use a sensor and follow the interstitial monitoring protocol. So I guess it's the reason I want to make sure I make that as clear as possible, because I think I've done a great job so far, is, if somebody does mess up, it's not the same criteria. Enforcement doesn't look at it the same, it's not even the same rule quote if it is a violation. So it's just like missing a month of doing your spill bucket and dispenser logs previously. So it's not like it's a level 1 or anything. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Okay. So for the form, number 4 is the applicable section for this. And, like I said, you just finish out the check boxes each month, initial, once you've covered all these questions. Okay, so this is a double wall spill bucket. Everybody's seen one with the float gauge in it. This one's actually failing, so it would require some attention. The sight gauge in there, I'll reiterate, is not the same as having an electronic sensor in there, and will not keep you from having to do your operability testing on a spill bucket. Okay, so the next 3 sections are going to fall on the methods of release detection. So as everybody knows, there's about 5 different methods that you can utilize. I wanted to go ahead and show you this before I went through each one of them instead of having it at the end of each section. So you'll be asked to check release detection equipment to make sure it's operating with no alarms or unusual operating conditions each month. You'll review and confirm that your records are current, and once you do that, you'll check your box. And I always recommend keep all your records with this form if you're doing compliance for a tank owner, because that way when we come, everything's organized and everything's together, and it just makes for a faster and less confusing inspection. Number 7, any suspected releases, document and report to the division as required. All right, so for ATG, excuse me, for ATG, you got to review your release detection records, make sure they're current, make sure you've got a pass for each month. Nothing's changed there as far as the requirements of what you have to have. We just have a spot on our walkthrough form for you to check that you've done that each month now. Make sure no alarms and unusual operating conditions, and make sure to let the division know if that is the case. For statistical inventory reconciliation, review your reports each month. Make sure your drop tubes are present. I know it's uncommon, but I have seen a couple of times during inspections where a drop tube has been removed for whatever reason. I don't know if somebody steals them for the metal or what, but anyway. Record your water level readings each month. That seems to be something that is easily forgotten with this method, is to check for water each month. A lot of tank owners, for whatever reason, forget to do that portion of the Also, be sure to include your inventory raw data with your monthly report. So that's the sheet that they use daily to record their beginning stick readings, their sales, and all that raw data. Make sure you include that because the inspectors will ask to see that most of the time. Okay, for interstitial monitoring, maintain your monthly liquid status reports and alarm history. Both of those are required. And like I said earlier, I recommend just keeping all that in an envelope with this form. And that way, when you're ready for an inspection, you've got everything together, and it's a lot smoother to go through. Document the date and location, cause of any corrective action taken for any alarms that you may occur on the back 2 sheets of our annual walkthrough form. There's a lot of this extra space for you to document anything that you've had to do at the facility. So if you've got, let's say you got 5 gallons of water out of the STP sump and reset the sensor, this will be where you would record what you did and how you addressed any alarms. Okay, manual tank gauging. This is such a rare method of release detection in Tennessee that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. If you do have a facility that uses this release detection, I recommend get with your local field office, contact Don or myself if you have any questions about this. But this chart is straight from our standardized inspection manual to show what qualifies and what doesn't qualify as far as how you can perform this method of release detection. Okay, so for the walkthrough form on the monthly section, we've got each method broken down. So, the form contains everything because it's going to be all-encompassing for every facility out there. So if you have a facility that has an ATG and utilizes that for their primary method of release detection for their tanks, you check the ATG box and then fill out those 2 questions associated with the ATG for each month to make sure that you meet your monthly requirements for an ATG. Same thing with CERD. You check that section, and then each month you answer those 4 questions, and as long as you have all that information, you'll meet your requirements. And hopefully this is going to help people avoid violations. Only time will tell on that, but I think it's a lot clearer what's required by having this form. As long as you complete the form, you should meet all the requirements to stay in compliance. Okay, so interstitial monitoring. Now there is some things obviously that fall outside of that, equipment-wise and things like that. But as far as release detection requirements and things like that, everything that's asked for in here will help you meet that requirement. Interstitial monitoring has got its own box, and then it asks you to make sure that you have a sensor status and alarm history report each month on question 1, and then for number 2, it asks that you have documented any location, cause, or action taken to investigate any alarm that you've had. And then if you select yes, then we'll be able to look on page 3 and 4 and make sure that we see what's happened to correlate with the alarms that show up during the inspection. Okay, excuse me. And then there's only one question with manual tank gauging. And it's just, does that liquid level exceed the weekly or monthly standard for that tank size? And that was what that chart that I had on the last screen shows, is the standards for each tank size that can be used in that method. Okay, so impressed current. Rectifier inspections are every 60 days. Nothing's changed there. We want you to record the as-left measurement on the rectifier, and I'll go over that on the form here in just a second to show you where to record that information. And then you want to also include your current voltage and amperage readings that you see the day that you do your inspection. If you've got an hour meter, record that as well, and then put the date of the inspection on the form. Also, if your rectifier readings change 20% or more from the time of your last test, then at any point during that 2 or 3 year period that your test is valid, if your readings change more than 20% from your as left reading, you need to investigate and have somebody qualified to come out and check that output of the rectifier to make sure that it's still protecting the tanks adequately. Okay, so here's the section on the form that I was talking about. So your as left measurement will go in these 2 boxes, and you'll just copy it every 60 days because it's going to be valid for 3 years. That number will be, unless you have to have a test, in the interim for a variance of 20% or more. And then this is where you would put the day you're out there, the volts and amps, if applicable, hour meter reading, and then the inspection date. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so dispensers, nothing new here much. Since 2005, we've required this. Now we're just asking to record it on the monthly walkthrough form. And then it's quarterly inspection. That's not changed. I want you to visually inspect for leaks. And if you do see a leak or notice any petroleum staining, make the repairs and document in the comments and what you did to make that repair. This is just an example of a potential scenario that you'll run into with the leaking diesel dispenser. It's got a couple seals, probably it's went out in it somewhere. Get a little drip here and one hanging from each one of your bolts on the bottom of the meter. Okay, so this is the portion of the form that involves the quarterly inspection of the dispensers. And just, it's pretty much the same as the previous form. It's just in one smaller section on our walkthrough form. Just ask that you initial and date the day that that inspection is completed. All right, so jumping to annual requirements. So this is, we've finished all the monthly requirements. Mark, was there any questions in the chat or anything on the monthly before I jump to the annual section?
My mouse went away for a second. No, I do not see any questions so far, so perfect. Thanks for the pause, but carry on.
Awesome. All right. So annually, need to check for damage of the floors, walls, and the lids of the sumps, any seals, boots, penetrations, cracks, any separation, and, most importantly, it's overlooked quite often, is that the sensor's located in the lowest point portion of the sump. So a lot of times it'll, on this bottom right picture here, you'll see that there's an elevated section where all your risers come out of this tank. A lot of times you'll see that sensor sitting there instead of on the side where it should be, because that gives you about 4 inches of liquid in there before it ever gets to the 4 or 5 inches of liquid before it ever gets to the sensor to activate it. So we ask that you set it at the lowest portion of the sump so it can be alarmed as quickly as possible. Excuse me. Okay. So I need to clean the sumps. It's hard to do a visual inspection of the sumps and the equipment that's in there if everything's coated in dirt and grime and road scum. You really can't see the components to see if anything's seeping or advanced corrosion or anything like that if everything's covered in gunk. So make sure those are clean before we come out to do our inspection and before you do your annual one as well. If you have a doubt, test it. If something looks like it's in bad shape, you got a rough looking flex connector or something, do a line test or something. Okay, so also liquid tight, if you got boots that are dry rotting and things like that, there's nothing wrong with testing them more than once every 3 years, just to make sure before you ask your tank owner to spend the money to replace it. Throw some water in there and leave it for an hour and see if it's going to hold. It may make it another year, who knows? But you really don't know unless you test it. Repairs. Make sure that you have a manufacturer approved or a UL approved method of the repair you're making. I'm sure all of you run into flex seal and things like that over the years. It is a requirement for the tank owners to keep all the repair documentation for the life of the system. So we're going to be looking to see what you did to fix some of these sumps as they're tested and failed, because hopefully there's some good methods out there that will save tank owners from having to replace the entire sump just because it's got a crack in it. I mean, I've not seen super great results from any of this stuff yet, but hopefully there's some new stuff out there and being created currently that's going to hold up. Okay, so also check your penetration fits, piping joints, conduits where it enters the sump, pump risers, lids, gaskets, test boots, make sure they're open. Close them for your hydrostatic test, obviously, but once you finish the test, make sure you open everything back up where you've got an open system again, because if you do forget to do that, that just opens up violations whenever we come around the next time. Also, compatibility is a pretty big thing that we're starting to look at more than probably previously, to make sure, ethanol percentages are on the rise, not necessarily in Tennessee yet, but E15 is pretty much in every state that surrounds us. For whatever reason, we don't have it here yet. But the flex fuel and the E85 blends have been around for quite some time, so there is compatibility issues with upgrading existing tanks to anything greater than 10%. So make sure you check all that before you switch somebody over. All right, so piping degradation, this is something we're starting to see with pretty much every flex pipe manufacturer that's over 20 years old nowadays. It's just starting to degrade, either by being in contact with water often or, product in the sump. But for whatever reason, we are starting to see more degradation of the flex pipe that's in the 20 to 30 year range of age. Typically, you find this in sumps without sensors, obviously, because if the water or petroleum is causing it, a sensor would be an alarm, and you would be able to remove that a lot quicker than if you only look at it once a year. You should deactivate any system that has piping in this kind of shape. Also consult your manufacturer, the piping manufacturer. At each of these instances, the top one there's APT, and Franklin did recommend that piping be replaced on that particular install. But you're welcome to get the piping manufacturers involved if you do see something like this. I believe at the bottom there we've got some environ that has grown, lengthened over time. This is all considered unusual operating conditions, so you definitely have to investigate it if you once you notice it. Okay, so leaks to containment areas. Obviously, you want to remove the liquids as soon as you have an alarm or as soon as you see it. Next question is, has the product escaped? So most of the time, what we'll do if it's a site that's either not interstitially monitored or is, we're still going to request that you do a hydrostatic test of that secondary containment to see if the product escaped from the sump. If you have metal components and liquid in the secondary, all this, excuse me, all these are issues that could degrade the pipe and require attention. Make sure that you report to us any unusual condition that you find at the site or unexplained presence of liquid. We obviously want you to immediately repair and replace it and get back in service as quick as you can. But Don, if there's anything that you want to chime in with on any of this, you're welcome to. I may forget something we had or leave it out. All right.
Hey, Dustin, I do have something too, not to get in front of Don, but Don, do you want to go ahead first? Or?
Oh, please go ahead, Mark.
Oh, okay. I had Bruce Warbaugh. He works out of our Chattanooga environmental field office. He made the observation that the annual walkthrough discussion pertains to sumps with IM and a clarification whether all sumps are required to meet the requirements, liquid type, penetration boots, and working order, etc. Anything to add to clarify Bruce's comment?
Bruce is correct. The secondary containment testing portion and all the walkthrough components apply specifically to sites that are using interstitial monitoring as their leak detection method when it applies to sumps. But obviously, if you have if you do not have under dispenser containment, that's still a component of the walkthrough, quarterly dispenser inspections, and I think that's where Bruce's question was going, was what sites are apply to interstitial, or what sites apply to these sections of the walkthrough, and it is primarily for sites that use them for leak detection. But if you have a submersible pump issue or a UDC issue, obviously there's reason to still investigate those matters. So.
Bruce, I've unmuted you. Did that address your comment? He may be on mute on his side, so I think that covered it. But Bruce, if you get unmuted on your side, please feel free. I do have moving on. I do have a question from Becky Huff. The hydrostatic sump test is only for interstitially monitored sites, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. Very good question.
You know, the only time that we would ask for you to do that is if you have a sump and it was installed before 2007, but you have, for whatever reason, you had a problem and we had fuel found in that sump for whatever reason. You know, we'd want to make sure that it didn't escape into the environment. So you may be asked to do a hydrostatic test on that sump in that situation. But as far as the 3-year requirement, you're not required to do a hydrostatic test on that sump if it's not used for interstitial monitoring on a routine basis. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, she replied, thanks for the answer, sir. I think that's all I've got on this side right now. Don, did you have other things you wanted to cover? Or?
Sure. We will continue the annual walkthrough portion of this presentation. Dustin's been
great.
Pretty comprehensive over what he's discussed here. Reporting requirements, I'll go into that a little bit. Obviously, the term unusual operating condition when it applies to a tank system is very broad. So if there's any doubt at any point in time, if you have an issue that is that makes the system no longer function as designed, we want to hear from you about that. So I just wanted to expand on that term a little bit. Some of these things that we're looking for during a walkthrough inspection, as I mentioned earlier, piping issues. It's becoming a more and more significant problem. We're not only in Tennessee, but we're hearing from additional states that with regard to flexible plastic piping, we're seeing more and more issues under containment sumps with degradation of different types, manufacturer wide. Across the industry, we're seeing different types of piping that have degraded significantly if it's been installed more than 20 years. So our inspectors are being asked, we're asking for owners and operators and contractors to all be diligent with this issue. And it's almost always we found this to be a problem where the piping has had significant exposure to liquid over an extended period of time, whether it be fuel or water. And this is the scenario where if you have a containment sump and it does not have a sensor in it, that's typically where you're going to have your water intrusion issues. So if you encounter this situation, our recommendations would be to deactivate the system immediately and replace that section of piping as approved by the manufacturer. And unusual operating condition is a not just the pumps are running slow. Visual or performance based, it's clearly defined in the regulations with examples. But if you see it and it's not right, report it. Is the basic premise trying to be accomplished there. All right, Dustin, could you advance the slide for me?
Again, or did it should not go through yet? Well, this one or this
Keep going.
one? Okay. I haven't went this far yet.
Okay. Prior to conducting a secondary containment inspection, I think Dustin's been pretty thorough about covering this previously. How can you, it's impossible to know what's in that sump unless you can visibly see it. So we've preliminarily, we've seen some walkthroughs conducted on sumps that our inspectors can even see the sump floor. So that obviously is an issue. Questioning the integrity of the sump is difficult to do if you can't see it at all. So we're encouraging people to clean those sumps as practically as possible. Talking under dispensers, filters, anything that's in there that's loose or doesn't belong there needs to be removed. And secondary containment boots should be in place and open to the piping. Secondary, that's a critical component of interstitial monitoring. The secondary is not open for communication to the sensor for liquid to flow through, then you're ultimately going to not be able to detect a release in that containment. Now, with regard to disposal of contact water, Dustin, could you go back for a second, please? Contact water. We try to have this discussion as often as we can with owners and service providers. Once test water has been disposed of properly, our inspectors are, and this is, why are we having a discussion about disposal of test water during a walkthrough? Is it's probably our most commonly asked question. What do I do with the water? Well, if documentation needs to be maintained by the owner that water has been properly disposed of. If you intend to take that water to a second facility and reutilize it, recycle that water for more testing, then I would highly encourage all owners and contractors to keep a cradle to grave list of where that water went, because ultimately you may be asked. The Division of Solid Waste Management with TDEC regulates the disposal of liquids or fuel contact water in this case. And there are options for permitted disposal through the Division of Water Resources. There are some alternative methods for disposal at wastewater disposal facilities, disposal through approved stormwater or sewer permitting authorities, but you got to get that in advance. So that's the reason that we're stressing that contractors be vigilant and owners be vigilant as well on how that water is properly disposed of and keep records. Another option that the industry has brought forward is the double wall containment sump, which we don't see a lot of in Tennessee at this time. It is beginning to be a commonly seen technology as we see more bit larger systems get installed statewide, because double wall containment sumps do allow you to avoid the triennial testing requirements for containment sumps. If as long as they are monitored with a mechanical or electronic sensor using one of the technologies, either with a brine field secondary or vacuum field secondary, hydrostatic testing on those sumps. One of the components of monthly leak detection for a site that's using SIR is, of course, a gauging stick, and this really should be present at every facility. It's a critical component of receiving fuel deliveries is knowing your before and after stick reading, and tanker doesn't always have one on it. So if you want your drivers to give you accurate deliveries, that's the main reason for mentioning it here. We realize most of the modern facilities that are doing interstitial monitoring or tank monitoring don't require, are not required to have engaging stick. But if you do have one, check it regularly, make sure that it's legible, the button's present on the bottom, and that the lacquer coating on the outside is still intact. And verifying take chart, and it's specifically for sites that are conducting SIR, but it's a recommended practice for anybody. So checking with water filing paste and ensuring that the site has a calibrated tank chart is a critical part of the walkthrough requirement for on an annual basis for a site that does SIR.
Don, I do have a question.
Sure.
From Michael Koblitz. Is the contractor's responsibility to report the issue?
Well, the regulation is specific to owners and operators. So as the rule is written currently, the owner and operator is primarily responsible for reporting issues to the division. I assume that Michael asked that question because if they do encounter an issue, are they required to report it? The answer is they're required to formally notify their owner and operator that there's an issue. Then reporting requirement falls on the owner, that not the service provider. Hope that answers your question, Mike.
All right. Let me open this mic up. Michael, I think I've got you unmuted now. Okay, well, I will respond to him in chat, in Q&A, and
Okay.
Don, thanks for that emphasis. Yeah, our rules obviously apply to owners and operators and their responsibility to comply. So, thanks.
In the present, thank you, Mark. In the presentation here, we've got examples of resources to obtain accurate tank charts. It's not uncommon to inspect a facility that doesn't have tank charts available. And particularly the original manufacturer's tank charts are not always appropriate, because if you have a tilted tank, or you have a shop fabric, a custom fabricated tank, say, for example, we have some 3-compartment systems, fiberglass or steel tanks that may not specifically match the volume requirements of the standalone tank. So manufacturers of those tanks are always available to provide a tank. If they built it, they should have a chart for it. So their websites are pretty useful, but we found that the easiest way to obtain an accurate chart is to either use a third-party SR vendor. They can build a chart for you if you give enough data over a 60-day period. That's always an option for a tank that doesn't meet spec. Tank monitor, if you have a tank monitoring system, they're automatically, they can be programmed to account for tilt and offsets and things like that. These are some examples of where you can obtain them. And as we mentioned during previous presentations, SIR is still a critical leak detection method in the state of Tennessee. It's in use in approximately 30% of our sites. As owners use SIR, they found that throughput is a critical component. More gas that goes through a system, typically the less stringent, or it's still an accurate method, and it still meets all of the certification requirements. But as the throughput on a tank increases, you're subject to less and less stringency with this method, just as you are any others. But if you have a site that's selling 8,000 gallons a day, a 30-gallon loss is much easier to miss, even with accurate stick readings. So that's why we ask all operators to be thoroughly familiar with this process. I know it's part of AB operator training. If it's not part of C operator training, it certainly should be. But hand in hand with the gauge and stick, tank chart, and water paste, every site should have one. Every site should have their operators trained how to use them. And the annual walkthrough requirements on these are just as important as checking the tank. So visually checking containment sumps for damage, that's always a priority. Removing liquid and debris from those containment sumps where it's found should be done as soon as practical. And if monitoring is being performed, be sure to check for leaks in the between the double wall containment sumps. I think I've had this discussion before with several owners and operators. If you have a monitored containment sump, then I just drew a blank on why this slide's still even in this one. Go ahead, Dustin. All right, I think I remember now, because what we're talking about here is eventually we're going to get into the reporting requirements. Standing liquid of any kind in a sump that is not, its integrity has not been verified, is, if I look at this example on the left and I see that liquid goes up to the lowest penetration fitting in that sump, that this site may not have a sensor. And if that's the case, then we have to have a procedure in place, such as hydrostatic testing, to verify that this containment sump did not release liquid fuel into the environment. Obviously, with the one on the right, any evidence of staining or significant amount of leak may warrant the inspector to investigate further. This is a question that we get a lot from contractors that have piping or flex connectors or swing joints or any metallic piping component that's in contact with water in a containment sump. Is that sump used for interstitial monitoring? If not, then maybe the addition of cathodic protection is the only necessity. So if that sump was installed before July 2007 and that piping system is not being used for IM, then your only priority at that point is ensuring that the metal components in that sump are protected. Record keeping requirements for all this testing that we're requiring now. Annual line tests are currently required to be maintained for 1 year. For suction piping systems, line testing is required every 3 years, so therefore you'd only be required to maintain the last single test. For mechanical and electronic line leak detector systems, 3 years. Those records should be maintained beginning at when our implementation period begins. So the new regulation requires that those records be maintained the last 3 tests. Same with sensors and console testing. Go ahead and change the slide, Dustin.
Oh, I did. We didn't talk about the spill bucket integrity test. Got to be kept for 3 years also. And if you had a vacuum pump or pressure gauge, it'll be 3 years. And then your overfill operability test is also 3 years. And a secondary containment sump integrity test would be 3 years also. This is one I added on right before this presentation. Since this form is final, like I said earlier, this just covers all the questions that are asked for the annual walkthrough inspection. And then we also have on the form everything that we just went over with the test record retention times. So this form, is ready to be used. Hopefully it was sent out to all the contractors by each field office that they work with. If you don't have a copy of it, just reach out to me after this presentation. I'll be happy to email you one and answer any questions that you have over it also. All right. Don't miss, stay tuned for next week's emergency generator and dual use presentation. That'll be conducted by Mr. David Stone, I'm pretty sure. And you're welcome to register for that webinar at the underlined address below. Again, any questions, welcome to reach out to myself or Mr. Taylor, and by phone or email, we'll help you any way we can. Is there any questions